Great. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I'm so glad to see some familiar faces and also to see some new people that I'm excited to get to know. My name is Erica Weisinger. I am a lecturer here at the Goldman School of Public Policy. I was so lucky as to do my PhD here, and my dissertation extensively used qualitative research methods, and I use qualitative research methods quite a bit as a researcher in the field now. It's definitely a passion, and I love giving students new ways of thinking about qualitative research and new ways of thinking about how they can integrate that into their final projects as well as your professional lives after you leave here. So with that, as you join, I encourage you to share in the chat your name, your pronouns, your program, the general topic of your likely project, and I encourage you to just scan what's already been written. I love it when students across programs find each other, students from different sections find each other, and to have opportunities to share and sort of cross-pollinate on ideas. So some of the framing of what I'll be talking about today is within the context of this idea of telling your story. And maybe in some of your cases, you're also telling somebody else's story, but your story being your final project. How are you going to tell that story, and how might qualitative research, and in particular interviews, but other forms of data as well, how might that inform you as you tell your story? So I want to start with a claim to consider that not everything that can be counted does not necessarily count, but everything that counts cannot necessarily be counted. So this idea of potentially elevating data that is not necessarily numerical, and how do we do that? So what we'll be covering today, first I'm going to give a little bit of context on qualitative research methods. Certainly within the MPP and MPA, there isn't necessarily a qualitative research requirement, though I think some of the research methods does cover aspects of qualitative research. So I just want to give you a little bit of context, and I'm a little less familiar with the MDP program in terms of how much you cover this, but I'm happy just to give a little bit of context. We'll talk about what kinds of interviews you're likely to conduct for your final projects, who you might want to interview and why, how to prepare, how to gain consent, how to ask good questions. And then at the end, I'll be talking about strategies for analyzing your findings, adding them to your report. And in particular, I'll be spending a little bit of time on data visualization for qualitative research methods. Any questions before we get started? And also, I think this will take about an hour. There will be a few opportunities for some interaction. There will be some breakout rooms. I'll make the breakout rooms a little bit on the bigger side, just recognizing that sometimes you might be driving, you might be in situations where you can't participate. So we understand if that's the case for you. So just starting with some background on qualitative research, I thought it would be helpful to just remind us of what research is generally, because I think this applies to qualitative and quantitative research, and I think it's helpful to situate qualitative research within this broader framework of what do we understand about research, and want to underscore this idea of it being a systematic application of a family of methods employed to provide trustworthy information about problems. It's generally a structured approach to gathering information that allows us to understand, theorize, or explain, and really underscoring this concept of this approach being organized and systematic. Qualitative research is an umbrella term that covers an array of techniques that are trying to describe, decode, translate, or otherwise come to terms with meaning of naturally occurring phenomena in the social world. Here, the focus again is really on generating meaning and understanding. The researcher is generally the primary instrument, and the focus is on generating meaning often through thick and rich description. It can be especially helpful in answering complex, exploratory, and multi-dimensional problems, something that probably applies to most of your projects. Some of the characteristics of qualitative research that I've already described, but just this idea of potentially inductive versus deductive reasoning, where researchers are gathering data to formulate theories as opposed to testing hypotheses. And I think there's a way in which sometimes qualitative and quantitative research are positioned as like competing fields or in opposition. And I just really want to invite you to think of it more as a harmonious complementarity between quantitative and qualitative research. One of my fields of research is children and families in the foster care system. And we have really rich quantitative data because so much of payment is tied to the statistics that we gather. So I can tell you a ton of information about kids entering into care and how many placements they have and how long until they exit. But so often the reports that I see that are quantitative in nature, they conclude with the notion that this report can tell you what is happening, but it can't tell you why it's happening. And so often those reports end with a recommendation for qualitative research to answer the why questions. So again, and conversely, oftentimes qualitative research concludes with encouragement to conduct further quantitative research to try to determine the generalizability of findings and the frequency of findings. Just a little bit more in terms of the background between quantitative and qualitative research. These are some of the differences in the focus, the philosophical roots, the goals of an investigation, the design, the strategy of data collection. And then other differences include the sampling method with qualitative research. There's really no shame in the research not being random. I want to introduce you to this word purposive, that you're being quite deliberate in choosing a sample that is going to yield a particular result, and you're not necessarily making a claim of a randomized sampling method. Your output is often themes, sometimes recommendations, sometimes a taxonomy, so a way of describing information, whereas quantitative data output or research output is often descriptive statistics, numerical findings, results of tests. These are some of the steps in qualitative research. And I think that these steps actually are the steps of most research. So whether your research is primarily qualitative or quantitative, most likely this is what these are the steps that you're most likely following, regardless of your methodology. I want to pause here in case there's any questions. Okay. Keep on moving. Some common sources of qualitative data for students. I will be focusing in this conversation mostly on interviewing and interview data, but I want to highlight for you some other sources of data that might be useful in your research that you may not be thinking about. So the first is documents. So this can be things like maybe there's a whole entire year worth of stakeholder meeting minutes that you can access through your client. Maybe there's administrative data like case records that's already collected that you can access. Maybe there's a set of emails that would be helpful additional context for you. So just really want to encourage you to think about alternative sources of data that your client might already have that could be illustrative, compelling, helpful in your research beyond the type of data that you would need to collect by conducting interviews. Another common source of data is focus groups, but more often focus group data, so data from focus groups that have already been conducted. I won't be talking a lot about focus groups today But one thing to think about with regard to focus groups versus one-on-one interviews, they can seem like a faster way to get a lot of information from a group of people. I have found that scheduling focus groups can be as time consuming as scheduling one-on-one interviews. With that in mind, I think for the purposes of a semester-long project, most likely the most you could do are 2 or 3 focus groups. That being said, I have seen some fantastic final projects that are focusing on analyzing focus group data that was already collected prior to the student's involvement. So it's worth asking if there is data out there that could use further analysis or that might be helpful to your research. Another source of qualitative data for GSPP students is open-ended survey data. So meaning, oftentimes in surveys, there's closed-ended responses, but there might also be a question like, is there anything else you want to say, or can you elaborate on your answers? And that would be a type of data catch that you could potentially conduct analysis on. And then finally, the focus of what I'll be talking about today, one-on-one interviews. So in terms of interviewing, before we even get started on talking about interviewing, I want to invite you to recall any experiences that you have had either being interviewed, perhaps for somebody else's research, or conducting an interview for someone else's research. Being interviewed or conducting an interview, maybe for your own research, and just really thinking about what went well and what could have gone better. So I'm going to put you in breakout rooms. I really hope that you can take this as an opportunity to meet somebody from a different program, and just invite you to reflect on this. These will be pretty quick, so I'm going to make the breakout rooms a bit small, and we'll just take 3 minutes to share. Oops. So again, the questions are, what went well and what could have gone better if you have had the experience of either being interviewed or interviewing somebody else?
Hey Kendrick,
Hi Hector, what's up?
can you hear me? Oh, very cool. So, are you an MPP student?
I am a law student and an MPP student.
Oh, cool. That's awesome. I don't think I've met someone with doing the double degree.
Yep, there are 6 of us. So,
Very cool. Let me see if I can start my camera.
oh, you definitely don't have to. I'm like, well, but it keeps me focused. So I'm like, okay, let me just put my camera on.
Let's see. My place is kind of a mess. I'm sorry. So,
No
very
problem.
nice to video meet you. So, going on these questions, I was thinking of the questions and the answers, and I don't think I have a lot of experience interviewing or getting interviewed for academic purposes, like any studies. Do you have anything that you've participated in?
Yeah, I have a lot actually, which is really weird. I know. I feel like I've been studied. It's been kind of odd. But what program are you in, Hector? I forgot. I don't think I got that.
I'm an MDP first year, and
Oh, nice.
yeah, yeah. Um, doing a project. Well, I'm actually getting ready for my practicum, which is a sort of an internship that we have in the middle of the program, and
Hmm.
I'm doing stuff around value chain and production chain, accounting for like ecological and social cost. And this is something that is used in consulting for so that decision makers can sort of know where they're standing with their um, like carbon usage or the pricing of their ecological usage for production, essentially.
Oh,
Um,
that's cool.
yeah. So, for the social cost part, I'm definitely using qualitative stuff. Sorry, you asked me one thing and I gave you like a whole story.
No, I appreciate it. I love background. Yeah, I think is our breakout room ending? Oh my gosh, it
Oh, wow,
is.
very
I didn't
quick.
even answer the question. Sorry. So what could have gone better is I've done a lot of ethnographic research. If you dominate the conversation and talk too long, it makes it so it's really hard for the individual that you're studying to like answer any question, right? And so that was really difficult coming in with preconceived notions. Like if I give you all the answers I
Oh.
want you to say, you're
Mm,
more likely to say them when I ask you a question, right? And so that was always difficult in ethnographic research.
that's very valuable. And what went well?
A lot of things have gone well. I mean, I think the idea of being able to take time and like having a exchange rather than having like a you need to respond to this question and you just sit here in silence, that's gone really, really well in the past, like giving people open-ended questions.
Nice. Thank you so much for sharing these things. Hopefully,
Yeah.
we get to talk more in the next breakout room.
Mhm.
To invite, if does anyone have anything they'd like to share in terms of what you talked about in your breakout rooms?
Yeah, I think I can share something. My name's Mireille. In my group, we talked a little bit about how we would like. So, one thing that is always good is to be really well written in the issue and the topic, I think. It gives you like a sense of control and the foundation to be, sorry for the noises. Oh, and the foundation to be like flexible when needed, because ultimately, I would love to people just pour out information and talk from their own place. And the optimum would be if I don't have to ask questions, but they just tell me everything. So I never want to like cut them short. I just want to get them talking.
Thank you. Anybody else? Madison?
Yeah, so my group, we talked about sort of the merits of sending your questions in advance to your interviewees so they have some time to think about it.
That's a great one, Madison. Thank you. Yeah, pros and cons for sure. That's a good one. And I actually don't talk about that. So I'm glad you mentioned it. Good. Well, I'm going to continue on, but there will also be an opportunity for you to share your collective wisdom. I often find that within any group of this size, there you actually people know a lot and have quite a bit of experience. But I think that just starting with remembering potentially how it felt to be interviewed can be a helpful reminder of putting yourself in the position of who you'll be interviewing and how they might feel. In particular, the idea that, even folks who you might view as experts and who you might be really intimidated to talk with, a lot of times those folks are intimidated to be interviewed. So just keeping in mind kind of the two-way experience of the interviewing encounter. So I'm going to keep on moving forward with some slides. And at this point, I want to talk with you a little bit about who you might be interviewing and why you might want to interview them. And as I already mentioned, the types of interviews I think are the interview methodology that's most common for the types of research that you're doing is what we would call purposive as opposed to random. So you're being purposeful and selecting the sample that you're potentially interviewing. And some strategies could be that you're wanting to talk to a typical person that is representative of the general viewpoint or the general idea. Another possibility is that you're looking for unique experiences or outlier experiences, which you might also think about as maximum variation or two-tier sampling. Just to give you an illustration of that, again, pulling from my work from my dissertation, I was looking at reasons why people who considered adopting children in foster care, why they dropped out of the process, so administrative barriers in the foster care adoption process. And so my primary group of people that I was talking with were those who dropped out. But I also interviewed people who were considered sort of like promoters of the foster care adoption process, who had completed a foster care adoption, who the agencies viewed as like their cheerleaders. And it really strengthened my findings when I could talk about challenges that people encountered who dropped out that were echoed by people who succeeded. Because then it was like, look, this is your successful group, but they're saying the same thing. So this idea of potentially having two tiers can also strengthen your findings. And then another common technique that I see is convenience sampling, which could also be snowball or chain sampling. And so what that might look like, I remember one of the students in this group is researching gentrification. So that might look like maybe they talk with a person who has been displaced by gentrification, and that maybe the way that they encountered that first person was just simply somebody in this group came forward and said, hey, I've experienced displacement from gentrification. And so then the student might gather the experiences, and then that person might lead them on to the next person. So that's called snowball or chain. So whoever your first interviewee is connects you to the next. And it's helpful just to explain your sampling method, just like with quantitative methods, you would explain, what kind of method you're using and why you're using it. The same is true for qualitative research methods, that you might well be using a convenient sample and explaining why you used that and how that impacts your findings. A common question people have are how many in a sample? And the answer is it really depends. If you have resources and time to conduct a lot of interviews, one way to know that you have a sufficient sample is that you've reached saturation, which means that you're not exposing new themes. For the most part, each successive interview that you conduct is giving you a similar set of themes. So that is one way to know. You can offer a tentative or approximate number based on your resources, which are generally your time and your money. And for the purposes of final projects at GSPP, I think 10 is a really common number. When people do too many more than that, I usually think that, and this is fine, but people who are able to do more than that, maybe they have a team of people who are supporting them. Maybe there's an administrative person who can help them schedule. Maybe they have a transcriptionist. Maybe they have resources behind them to do more than 10. But if you're doing it by yourself, I think that 10 is a heavy-ish lift for yourself. So that might just be a number to keep in mind, depending on the types of interviews you're conducting and what your other research methods might be. These are some common types of interviews, so structured or standardized. And in this scenario, your question order and structure is predetermined. You could think of that as an oral form of a written survey. Another strategy could be semi-structured interviews, which would include both structured and open-ended questions. And in this case, the question order is flexible. And the final is unstructured or informal, where the questions are completely open-ended, flexible, exploratory, and it's more like a conversation. So for the most part, for the projects that you're likely to conduct for the purposes of your work here, semi-structured interviews are the most common types of interviews that you're likely to conduct. And I like this sort of metaphor of a guided walk where there's guardrails, but you don't really know where you're going to end up. It's kind of up to the meandering nature of the conversation as to where you will end up. And in this scenario, as I already said, the question order is flexible. It includes some combination of open-ended and structured questions. In terms of determining the kinds of questions you want to ask, some things you might ask yourself are, what is the puzzle you're trying to resolve? Another question might be, how will you be organizing your eventual report thematically, potentially? And if so, those broad themes might be the broad questions that you want to ask of your interviewees. You may not know this right now. It's just something for you to start to think about. I will be sharing my slides at the end, most likely through email. So don't worry if you're not getting all of this. These slides will be coming to you as well. So in terms of conducting your interviews, I do recommend creating an interview guide. Some people call this an interview protocol. This is just a listing, sort of like a script of the areas that you hope to cover in an interview. It can include a list of topics or questions for a given subject area. And I recommend that a guide gives you enough areas to cover in about a 1 hour interview. This usually would be 4 to 6 topic areas, and there might be probing questions beneath those broader questions. I recommend starting with more neutral, safe questions, and then moving toward descriptive, opinion-oriented, or potentially controversial questions, ending with deeper questions. And at the very end, if you need to collect demographic data, I suggest you do it at the very end. Sometimes you can do it with a short survey with just 3 or 4 questions that you care about, or you could just ask them in the moment. But I don't recommend starting a open-ended interview with demographic questions because it's often just a little bit boring for the recipient. Here's just an example of a structured interview protocol. You can see there are looks like 1, 2, 3, 4 broad topic areas with some questions beneath that, and potentially adding some probes as well. And also in the materials that I send you following this conversation, I'll give you some more examples of student protocols for the work that they have done. A really important component of conducting interviews is the concept of consent. So this means that you think ahead about the pros and cons of an interview being on the record, off the record, or some combination of the two of those things. So if you need or want the conversation to be on the record, what that means is that you'll be naming your interviewee, potentially referencing them in your report, possibly quoting them in the report. Now, you could quote them, but anonymize who the respondent is. It's just a question of quite a few variables that are going to be quite specific to your context. So some ways of helping you decide which of these approaches you want to use. I'll come back to this slide, but just some things to help you think about are, again, the benefits and drawbacks of your interviewee being on the record, the possibility that they might share more if they're off the record, the potential that your report would carry more weight if they're on the record. And again, just to say there isn't one right answer, it's just that it's important to establish what you hope, and then to seek clarification at the outset of an interview as to whether the person is willing to be on the record or not. I will say that I have seen quite a few final projects where the student has it in their mind that the interview should be confidential and off the record, when oftentimes the people that they're talking to really couldn't have cared less about being on or off the record. And I think that sometimes it diminishes some context that would be helpful to the reader if the student would have been able to say, I conducted 10 interviews with, these 10 individuals who are heads of these agencies. So sometimes I think there's an unnecessary confidentiality when it could have served all parties for the person to be on the record. Does anybody want to weigh in on this in terms of your personal experience or personal thoughts that you're having in terms of this idea of consent, and when and why you might want your interviewee to be on or off the record? I encourage you. Oh, go ahead, Rachel. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. I can chime in. So for my final project, for the MDP, I'm working on electric vehicle infrastructure planning. And this is a continuation of previous work. So I've already conducted a number of interviews. And I've been interviewing people at different city departments, also people from different private companies, from different utilities. And I've noticed that, or the way that I have sort of cited them is I spoke to individuals at the following organizations. I did not, I heard from a couple people that they didn't want to necessarily speak on behalf of their whole sort of large organization. And I felt like that was a nice way to acknowledge where I was getting my information from without putting names.
That's a really nice common sort of hybrid approach to not necessarily name an individual, but potentially to describe a type of position that they're in, or something about their status that can help you, not status in the sense of like how impressive they are, but like, maybe it's a student or somebody who dropped out of a process, or somebody who completed a process, or somebody who experienced displacement, rather than the name itself. Thanks, Rachel, for that. In terms of the logistics of beginning an interview, I'm sorry, I just want to back up and just underscore this idea of whatever you decide to do in terms of consent, that it's explicit, that when you begin the interview, you talk about it. You talk about why it might be helpful to have the person on the record, but perhaps also to respect that they might be more willing to share if it's off the record. And then in terms of this hybrid approach, something that I'll often do is I'll say, this is a background conversation. It's helping me with my learning. I usually do record my conversations. Often in the Zoom world, it seems pretty common to record things on Zoom. And I will say, if I were to go back and quote you directly, I will email you and let you know the quote and ask for your permission before I share that in a published or in a report. So that could be a nice kind of safe way for a person to share, and for you to reserve the hope to quote them on the record if you hope to do that. So just want to give that as a possible pointer. In terms of beginning an interview, I encourage you to describe your motives and your intentions. So often, what is the purpose of the study? What are you going to be doing with this information that you're gathering? Whether or not you'll be protecting their anonymity, explaining who has final say over content, and then logistics, how long the interview will take, the number of subsequent interviews you may or may not need to conduct with that person, or similar people that might be similar to the person you're interviewing. In terms of asking questions, these are just some characteristics of good questions, that they ideally are yielding descriptive data, stories. I recommend piloting interviews to help you arrive at good questions. I know that in some of the seminars that people are enrolled in, it's a common technique to practice your interview protocol with another student to just see how your questions are coming across, and making sure that you're not using jargon or words that your interviewee may or may not understand. In terms of establishing rapport, this is probably information that is very sort of known for you, but of course, it's worth saying that being respectful, non-judgmental, non-threatening is just a beginning. Communicating that your respondent is the expert, that the reason that you're having this conversation is because you care about what they say, and you view them as an expert. Maybe they're an expert in the lived experience of having been displaced due to gentrification. So really positioning them as the expert and you as the learner. Assuming neutrality, even if what the person is saying is antithetical to your beliefs, that you're there to learn, not necessarily to argue your position or your point. So to view this potentially as a partnership between you and the person you're talking with, as a really key aspect of establishing rapport. These are some of the broad categories of questions you might include. And I want to give you some ideas of policy-specific prompts that you might ask. So things like, what's the real problem? What are some viable, asking your respondent, like, what do you think are some possible solutions, policies, alternatives to a given problem? And then asking them to project the outcomes for you. What might those policies ultimately lead to? Using the opportunity to understand the criteria or the values that matter most, potentially to your client or to the person you're talking with. A fun question to encourage blue sky thinking, where you're just breaking out of sort of norms or expectations. If you had a magic wand, how would you solve this problem? It used to be, if you had $1 million, what would you do? But now I think it's $1 billion. If you were in charge, how might you solve the problem? And then another question, what keeps you up at night, can yield some interesting answers. So these are just some potential policy specific prompts. And then these are some examples of how you might think about wording your questions, that they would be short and to the point, focused on one dimension, unambiguously worded, could be open-ended, ideally non-threatening, unless, maybe there could be a certain type of interview or a certain kind of context where you do want to ask a question that might make somebody really think. So this notion of non-threatening, it just kind of depends on the context. Ideally, you're wording your questions in a way that cannot be answered with a simple yes or no answer. Instead, leading with, just, can you describe for me, how might that happen? Can you describe your experience for me? Those kinds of questions. And again, a good way to test your questions is to pilot them. These are what we call probes. So you've asked your question, maybe you want them to dig deeper. These are some examples of probes that you might ask to get more information. Just some more examples. I want to make sure I want to make sure I understand. Can you explain that more? What's the best way for me to summarize your point for the notes? This is actually a really good one if they're rambling, to ask for a summary. And then also to consider concluding with questions like, I want to make sure I got that right. The top 3 most important things I heard you say are XYZ. And that can give them an opportunity to reflect on what they've already said and for you to make sure you're capturing it. These are some close-ended questions that you might also want to include. Again, like trying to capture what they've said. So is it fair to say that this is true? Checking in about a hunch that you might have. These are some other just like reasons why you might want to ask close-ended questions. And it's fine to have a mix of open and close-ended questions in your interviews. Sometimes you'll go from big abstract ideas to more concrete ideas, and these questions can help you do that. Generally, we recommend avoiding leading questions, close-ended questions if what you actually want is a narrative response. We recommend avoiding asking multiple questions at once, so double-barreled questions, because that usually will enable people to just selectively answer whatever they want to answer. An example of a double-barreled response might be, can you tell me about the quantity and quality of your experience with this program? Or how many times and what was the quality of the experience? They might just speak to the quantity or the quality, but not both. So you would want to potentially separate that into 2 questions. Some people recommend against asking why questions, like just simply why, because it can be one of those questions that makes somebody feel like they have to defend themselves or explain themselves in a way that could put them in a position of feeling defensive. So potentially avoiding why questions is a recommendation. And once again, piloting questions with yourself or with a friend who answers as minimally as possible to see how it goes can be a strategy to see if your questions are eliciting the types of responses that you want to receive. Here are some ways that I recommend wrapping up interviews. Is there anything else you'd like to share that I didn't ask you about? Are there questions you'd suggest I include in future interviews? And in particular, for those of you doing snowball sampling, ending with, who else do you think I should interview? And some variations on this could be things like, who would you suggest I talk to that might have a really different perspective than yours? Who really disagrees with you, and who might I talk to that would give a different point of view? Could be another variation on that. And feel free, if anyone wants to use the chat, to share your expertise on thoughts on wrapping up interviews that you think might be helpful to your peers. I want to talk about recording. I do recommend recording if you're in a potentially, especially a Zoom context, that recording can ensure that everything that is said is preserved for analysis. It can free you up to listen instead of intently note-taking. In order to do this, though, you do have to obtain consent. And as you can see with Zoom, there is a pop-up, but it's helpful to also verbally request consent. And it may feel like your responses would be altered by the fact that you're recording, but quite a few studies have shown that people usually forget that they're being recorded and do tend to speak more naturally than you might expect, given that it is being recorded. Now, this being said, if you have limited resources in time in particular, you might choose to not record and just take notes, because then you have the data collection there in front of you, and you don't have to take twice as long to transcribe. Most of you, if you have a Berkeley Zoom account, there is a checkbox that you have to set up ahead of the interview to generate a transcript, but you have to do it ahead. So it's one of the settings in your Zoom to generate a transcript. And just, again, it has to be done ahead of time. You can't do it after the fact. And I wish I could give you more specifics on that, but it's one of those things that every time I do it, I can't remember how I did it. There's like so many settings in Zoom. It's quite remarkable, all the options. And if you forget to, if you recorded it, but you forgot to generate the transcript, I've had really good luck with Temi. It's TEMI, and it's a fantastic free transcription service. So that's an alternative. And then the other thing I've done is I have played a recording on Zoom to generate a transcript. So those are some workarounds. And just a little more on thinking about power dynamics and interactions between interviews and respondents, just acknowledging that there is a rich field of research that really thinks about ways that there's a lot of history, in particular in the fields of anthropology and sociology, around certain types of interviews being extractive and exploitative. So just being aware of this history, and I encourage you to look to things like critical theory, race theory, feminist theory, critical race theory, as lenses to think about the interview encounter, and in particular to think about who's controlling the direction of the interview, who's controlling the benefits, who's controlling the results. And I think there are some exciting moves towards maybe not having interviews, but more having conversations, and possibly people in like-minded situations mutually interviewing each other as another strategy, just depending on the type of data collection that you're up to. But all of these theories really have in common a common concern for participants and their voices, the power dynamics inherent in an interview process, the construction of story, and forms of representation. So I think this is a really important point. And so I want to give you the chance to talk about this a little bit, potentially by sharing tips that you might have with each other. And I'm going to put that in the chat. I do have about 10 more slides to cover. So I want to encourage you to use this Google Doc that I just shared in the chat as a resource. But I apologize, I'm not going to pause right now for you to fill it out. But as I said before, I think that there's often really tremendous amount of collective wisdom within a group like this. So just urge you to share your thoughts and to read what each other has to say about thinking about these questions of this power relationship between the interviewer and the respondent, and how we can conduct these interviews responsibly. So I want to pivot now to just helping you think about data visualization for qualitative research. And this is, I think, helpful to think about sooner rather than later. What do you want your final product to look like? And how might your interviews be displayed visually in ways that are compelling to your reader? I know from many years of conducting qualitative research that this is what people usually think an interview would look like, or ways of displaying qualitative data. And I just want to encourage you to think about ways that it can be something that looks really different. And I want to give you an example of a word cloud. So within the data visualization fields, a lot of people love to hate word clouds. Word clouds, just for those of you who aren't familiar with them, they make the words bigger that appear more often in a qualitative data set. And in this example, this is an analysis of text messages at the beginning of a relationship compared to at the end of a relationship. And it's sort of a fun / depressing example, but I just want to underscore ways that you might think about positioning your data to show contrast. So when you ask your questions, especially if you're generating transcripts, to think ahead about, might you want to do something like this? And if so, what kinds of questions could you ask that would evoke contrast? So an example of this could be, how did you feel when you first moved into your neighborhood? Or how did you feel growing up in your neighborhood? Would be the first question. And the second might be, how did you feel after you were displaced from the neighborhood where you grew up? And you could imagine word clouds that would generate an extreme contrast there. Another strategy is to potentially have some type of image to create word art. This is called Wordle. And it's just a free online app that you can use. There's also free online apps to generate word clouds. It's just that you have to have your data. You could cut and paste from, say, a Microsoft Word document or a Google Doc to generate word clouds for specific question areas. These are packed bubbles. You can see quite a few different things going on here for this data visualization. So this is an example from the Pew Research Center in which they visualized one-word descriptions of Barack Obama with packed bubbles. They're similar to word clouds, but the word frequency is depicted through the size of the bubble. And then they've also got some colors here for positive, negative, or neutral. And you can see how just by scanning this, you're getting an image, a perspective of a whole lot of rich qualitative data. Here's another technique where you can showcase open-ended survey data besides close-ended data. So combining this, and this can be helpful when your survey has potentially close-ended and open-ended questions. And you can tie responses together into one chart to add context. So in this example, a survey asked nonprofit representatives of nonprofit organizations to describe what it was like to work with an evaluator. And then the survey asked them why their experience was good or bad. And so, you know, for 33% who said excellent, there are concrete examples of how that was excellent. And it can just be a nice way to showcase, you know, both types of responses. If and when you are in a position of being able to identify your respondents, it can be helpful to potentially include a picture to humanize the person who's speaking. So again, for non-anonymous responses, that this can be a technique that can bring ideas and perspectives to life based on a person. I'm mindful of time. So this is just another really broad topic area that I'm just going to kind of briefly touch upon. And this is the idea of data analysis and qualitative research. And just very briefly, what you do in this situation, you have qualitative data, you code that data, and then you develop themes from the data. And generally people do this using qualitative data analytics software. I really recommend Deduce, and because we only have a short amount of time left, if you think you might want to use Deduce, I want to just let you know about the D Lab here at UC Berkeley. They are a tremendously helpful resource to help you learn how to use Deduce and how to set up a project in Deduce. It's, I think, about $10 for a subscription for, so it could end up being like $50 for the semester to have a Deduce subscription. And this is what it looks like to code qualitative data and to create themes. This is an example of a type of output that you might have where you can look at co-occurring themes. This type of software also enables you to do things like word clouds without sort of doing one-off finding free software to do one thing or another. Something like Deduce has the power to create all kinds of data visuals for you in one place. Now, if you're only conducting 10 interviews and qualitative data isn't one of your primary data sources, I don't think you need to use Deduce. However, if you have access to, let's say, 100 pages or more of qualitative data, maybe I'll even lessen that to say 20 to 50. Once you start getting up there with your quantity of qualitative data, that's where you might want to start thinking about using Deduce. You might want to use it just simply because you want to have the experience of learning to use it. So maybe you only have 10 interviews, but you just want to learn how to do this, in which case, go for it. I'm going to keep going, and I completely understand if you need to sign off, but I do want to just talk a little bit more about some additional points. So just again, mindful that it's almost 1 o'clock, and if you have to sign off, that is fine. But I want to just briefly talk about this idea of incorporating interviews into your report. And also thinking about why you might want to use direct quotations in your report versus communicating things perhaps by summarizing. In general, using the language of an original source is best if you're wanting to evoke the particular thing, potentially the particular phrasing, a particular imagery, or a situation where a paraphrase or summary just isn't as effective as a direct quote. You might also want to directly quote somebody if they are considered a source, perhaps of lived experience, a particular credible source that it strengthens your report to actually quote them. So this is kind of the strategy that you'd want to use of introducing the idea that the quotation will support, including the quote, and then explaining how the quote helps support your claim. You can, in terms of incorporating interviews into your report, it can just simply be a background that informs your approach. And in that case, no direct quotes are needed. But it could be, as I already showed you, this perspective that you're using to explain your ideas. But regardless of what approach you use, I do recommend including a methodology explaining the approach that you took, and an appendix potentially listing the types of interviews and account of the interviews that you conducted. This is an example of a report from a student, Mimi Kaplan. This report is available for you to read online in our GSPP database of prior research. And Mimi's report was based almost entirely on interviews. And you can see how she organized her findings into the major themes from her interviews. She also is using active headings so that you can imagine, if you flip to page 9, you'll see why landowners mistrust government. On page 10, you'll see how labor and equipment costs are key challenges for landowners, etc. So just want to give you an example of how a particular student used qualitative interviews as a strategy for organizing her report findings. This is an excerpt from Mimi's report. She's talking about the high cost of restoration and conservation projects in the Sacramento Delta. So she's introducing her quote, she's giving the quote, she's somewhat anonymizing it. It's a farmer, an individual from the Delta community. And then she's building on that from another person and then explaining it. So kind of following that format that I described. So just some key takeaways that I hope that you've gotten. And again, I'll be happy to share both these slides as well as some of the references, including examples of interview protocols and some reports that I thought made really great use of qualitative data, and some strategies for data visualization. So I will be happy to share all of those things later today. But some key things that I hope that you can take away are, first of all, you got this, you can do this, that interviewing can be a really key and valuable component of your work, to encourage you to develop your interview guide ahead of time, also to know when to stop, to know when you've gathered enough information, and thinking about the structure that your eventual report will follow can be quite helpful in thinking about how you want to structure your interview guides. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm very happy to stay on if people want to ask additional questions, and encourage you to just stay in conversation with your peers on how interviewing is going for them, and really just viewing your cohorts as tremendous repositories of information on learning how to do this and how to do it as well as you possibly can. So with that, I thank you, and happy to stay if anybody has questions.